My daughter-in-law sent my wife an 18-dish Thanksgiving list and ordered her to cook it entirely alone. So I booked us both a first-class flight to Hawaii and left a single note on the empty dining room floor. Her hysterical phone call came right in the middle of our oceanside dinner. My name is Walter Ashford. I am 66 years old, and I spent 40 years of my life as a forensic auditor, tracking down hidden assets for federal courts. I know how to find the truth, and more importantly, I know how to dismantle a lie. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family member who severely underestimated your worth. The kitchen smelled of stale wine. It smelled of congealed grease. It smelled of profound disrespect. I stood in the doorway of our own home, watching the woman I have loved for 42 years bear the weight of our son's arrogance. Marlene stood at the sink, her frail hands trembling as she scrubbed crusted porcelain plates. She shifted her weight from her left foot to her right. A sharp, involuntary oasis crossed her face, a painful betrayal of the double knee replacement she had endured just 10 months ago. 10 months of grueling physical therapy. 10 months of learning how to walk without agony. And here she was, anchored to a sink full of cold, greasy water, cleaning up the wreckage of a dinner party our daughter-in-law Bridget had hosted the night before. Bridget had demanded to use our spacious suburban home to entertain her friends, claiming her own apartment was too cramped. Marlene, always the peacemaker, had agreed. Marlene had stayed out of sight, and now Marlene was paying the physical price. I watched the tremor in my wife's shoulders. I watched the way she leaned heavily against the marble counter just to keep herself upright. The anger that ignited in my chest was not a sudden explosion. It was a cold, creeping frost. It was the absolute crystallization of 40 years of blind paternal leniency finally freezing over. I walked across the kitchen. I did not speak. I gently, but firmly, took the abrasive sponge from her wet, shaking hands. I turned off the faucet. The sudden silence in the kitchen was heavy. I guided Marlene by her waist, leading her away from the sink and easing her into the padded chair at the kitchen island. I handed her a towel to dry her hands. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my son, Curtis. The phone rang 3 times before he answered. The background noise of his downtown financial office hummed through the receiver. I did not offer a greeting. My voice was a low, controlled hum, a tone I had reserved exclusively for hostile witnesses during my auditing years. I told Curtis to contact a professional cleaning service immediately. I told him to send them to my house within the hour to clean the mess his wife had left behind. I expected an apology. I expected the son I raised to recognize the sheer entitlement of leaving his recovering mother to scrub his wife's wine glasses. Curtis scoffed. The sound was sharp, dismissive, and utterly devoid of respect. He told me I was overreacting. He claimed Bridget was simply too overwhelmed right now, frantically preparing for her wealthy parents' upcoming holiday visit. He told me to stop making a fuss over a few dirty plates, suggesting that Marlene needed the exercise anyway to keep her joints moving. He spoke to me not as a father, but as an inconvenience. He spoke of his mother, not as a human being in pain, but as an unpaid domestic servant who should be grateful for the distraction. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I simply hung up the phone. The line went dead. The silence returned to the kitchen. I looked at Marlene, who was rubbing her aching knees, her eyes fixed on the floor to hide her tears. In that exact moment, my son ceased to be my son. He became a liability. He became a target. I left Marlene resting with a cup of hot tea and retreated to my study. The room was lined with thick leather-bound books and heavy mahogany shelves, a sanctuary built on logic, numbers, and accountability. I opened my laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated the dark wood of my desk. Before my retirement, I spent 4 decades dismantling corporate fraud. I spent my life hunting phantom assets, uncovering hidden ledgers, and exposing men who believed they were smart enough to hide their greed. I knew how money moved. I knew how liars operated. I logged into the joint emergency bank account. It was a high-yield savings account I had established for Curtis years ago, with my name still attached as the primary guarantor. It was a safety net. More specifically, it was a safety net intended strictly for Marlene's ongoing medical expenses, her co-pays, her premium physical therapy sessions, and the future surgeries we knew she might eventually need. It was the protective wall I had built around my wife's health. I opened the transaction history. The numbers did not align. The balance was drastically, horrifyingly low. A systematic bleed revealed itself in cold digital ink. I stared at the screen, my eyes tracing the lines of data. Thousands of dollars had been siphoned off in untraceable rolling transfers over the past 6 months. It was not a single desperate withdrawal for a legitimate crisis. It was a calculated, methodical extraction. They were precise amounts, designed to fly just under the radar of automated bank alerts. I did not panic. I became an auditor. I traced the routing numbers. I followed the digital breadcrumbs through the banking network. The destination was an auto dealership, a luxury European auto dealership in the wealthiest district of the city. Curtis had been draining his mother's surgical recovery fund to lease a top-tier luxury SUV. He was bleeding the money intended for Marlene's physical therapy to finance a leather-seated status symbol to impress Bridget's parents. The betrayal mutated in my mind. It evolved from emotional negligence to outright calculated theft. Curtis had looked at his mother's pain, looked at the money meant to alleviate that pain, and decided that his wife's vanity was a higher priority. He had stolen her comfort to purchase a facade. I sat in the quiet of my study, the blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes. I did not feel sorrow. I felt nothing but the absolute terrifying clarity of a man who has just been given permission to destroy. The heavy thud of the front door, swinging open, shattered the quiet of the house. There was no knock. There was no greeting. Bridget strode into the living room, her designer heels clicking aggressively against our hardwood floors. The sound was a rhythmic, invasive tapping that echoed through the hallways. She ignored me completely as I stepped out of my study. She did not even acknowledge my presence. She marched directly toward the kitchen where Marlene was still resting. Bridget reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. The paper was embossed, heavy, and pretentious. She dropped it onto the coffee table in front of Marlene. The envelope landed with a dull smack. Bridget crossed her arms, looking down at my wife with a gaze dripping in condescension. She did not ask for a favor. She issued a command. She demanded that Marlene cancel her physical therapy appointments for the entirety of the next week. She stated that the house needed to be sterilized, reorganized, and perfectly staged for her parents' impending arrival. Her tone was sharp, brittle, and entirely devoid of basic human decency. I stepped between them. I placed my body between my recovering wife and the woman who viewed her as a disposable asset. My eyes locked onto Bridget's. I kept my posture relaxed, but my voice was as hard as granite. I told Bridget to pick up her envelope. I told Bridget to turn around. I told Bridget to leave my home immediately and never enter without knocking again. Bridget did not retreat. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that scraped against the walls of the room. She tossed her hair back, her expression twisting into a sneer of absolute entitlement. She informed me with a triumphant smirk that I had no right to kick her out. She stated that Curtis had already promised her the house. He had assured her that our home would be entirely at her disposal for the holiday week, completely cleared of our presence if necessary. She looked around our living room, her eyes raking over the crown molding and the antique furniture we had worked decades to acquire. "This old place is the least you can offer," she said, her voice dripping with venomous privilege. "My parents are used to a certain standard. Curtis knows this is the only way we can host them without being humiliated. You should be grateful we're willing to use it." She turned on her heel, the aggressive clicking of her shoes fading down the hallway. The front door slammed shut, rattling the picture frames on the walls. I stood in the center of my home, the echo of the slamming door ringing in my ears. I looked down at the thick embossed envelope, resting on the coffee table, like a venomous snake waiting to strike. I did not touch it yet. I looked at Marlene. She was shaking, her hands gripping tightly in her lap, her eyes wide with the realization of what our son had allowed his wife to become. I walked over to my wife. I knelt down beside her chair, disregarding the ache in my own aging joints. I took her trembling hands in mine. I promised her, in a voice that left no room for doubt, that she would not cook a single meal. I promised her she would not scrub a single floor. I promised her that the illusion Curtis and Bridget had built was about to collapse, and they would be buried in the rubble. I walked back down the hallway, the aggressive sound of my daughter-in-law's designer heels still echoing in the silence of my own house. The air felt heavy, tainted by the sheer audacity of what had just occurred. I stepped into the kitchen, the afternoon light angled through the blinds, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. Marlene was sitting on the wooden stool at the center island. She was not sobbing loudly. She was weeping with the silent, suffocating grief of a mother who had just realized her sacrifice meant absolutely nothing. Her hands, slightly curled from years of tending to our family, were pressed against her face. Her posture was completely defeated. Just 10 months ago, I had held her hand as the anesthesia wore off from a grueling double knee replacement. I had watched her bite her lip in agony as she learned to walk again, step by painful step, determined to be healthy enough to play with the grandchildren we naively believed our son Curtis and his wife Bridget would one day give us. Now that same resilient woman was trembling over a piece of thick cream-colored paper. I stepped up beside her. I placed a steady hand on her shaking shoulder. I looked down at the documents Bridget had thrown onto our coffee table, which Marlene had carried into the kitchen like a death sentence. It was not a simple request. It was a manifesto of cruelty. The pages were heavy, embossed, and printed in a sharp, elegant font that mocked the vulgarity of the words it formed. It was a Thanksgiving menu, but it was not the warm, comforting list of family recipes Marlene had perfected over 40 years of marriage. It was an 18-dish culinary marathon designed for a luxury hotel, not a suburban kitchen. My eyes scanned the ridiculous demands. A heritage breed turkey to be basted with a specific herb butter every 20 minutes. Truffle-infused potato puree. Hampstead quail eggs with caviar. Artisanal sourdough, baked entirely from scratch. And at the bottom, a strict minute-by-minute schedule of when each complicated dish was to be presented in the formal dining room. It was physically impossible for a healthy professional chef to manage alone without a team, let alone a 64-year-old woman with artificial joints who was medically required to stay off her feet. But the sheer volume of the labor was not the poison. The true poison was injected into the final paragraph. I read the words, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. Bridget had written explicit instructions on how the evening was to proceed. She demanded that our best antique china, the delicate floral set Marlene had inherited from her own mother, be polished and set out for her wealthy parents. And then came the final directive. Bridget instructed Marlene to remain entirely out of sight in the kitchen once the guests arrived. She wrote that Marlene could pass the serving platters through the swinging door to Curtis, but she was under no circumstances to join them at the dining table. The exact words were burned into my retinas. She claimed that older people ruined the aesthetic of a modern upscale holiday gathering. She wrote that my wife, the woman who had welcomed Bridget into our family with open arms, who had knitted blankets for her, who had cooked countless meals for her, would simply disrupt the sophisticated atmosphere her parents expected. It was a calculated, deliberate eraser of a human being. I looked from the clinical printed paper to Marlene's tear-stained face. For 3 decades, this kitchen had been the warm, beating heart of our family holidays. I remembered Curtis, as a little boy, sitting on that exact same wooden stool, swinging his short legs, begging his mother for a taste of her famous pecan pie before the guests arrived. Marlene had always obliged, smiling, dusting white flour from her apron, pouring all her love into the food she prepared for our son. She had created magic in this room, and now the boy she had nurtured and protected had allowed his wife to reduce her to an unseen, unpaid servant in her own home. He had authorized this deep humiliation. He had essentially handed them the knife. I did not yell. I did not curse. Anger is a wildly unpredictable emotion. It makes you reckless. It makes you loud. In my 40 years as a forensic auditor, tracking down hidden offshore accounts and dismantling the elaborate financial lies of corrupt executives, I learned that the most destructive force on earth is not unbridled rage. It is absolute quiet clarity. When a fraudster realizes you have found their hidden ledger, it is not your shouting that breaks their spirit. It is the silent, undeniable weight of the evidence closing in on them. I looked at the 18-dish menu. This was their ledger. This was the undeniable proof of their moral bankruptcy. I reached out and gently slid the thick pages from beneath Marlene's shaking hands. She looked up at me, her eyes red and wide with a heartbreaking confusion. She whispered that she did not know how she could possibly stand by the stove for 3 straight days. She wondered aloud if she should order a tall stool to sit on while she cooked, desperately trying to figure out how to comply with an impossible, degrading command just to keep the peace. She was still trying to be an accommodating mother to a son who had already discarded her humanity. I hushed her gently. I kissed the top of her head. I told her in a voice devoid of all doubt that she would not be cooking a single dish. I held the pages in my right hand. They felt heavy, weighed down by the sheer arrogance of the woman who printed them, and the complicity of the son who permitted it. I turned away from the kitchen island and walked slowly toward the living room. My footsteps were steady on the hardwood. Every sound in the house seemed magnified by the ringing silence, the low hum of the refrigerator, the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I stopped in front of the large brick fireplace that anchored our living room. It was cold and swept clean, waiting for the harsh winter months. I picked up a small box of matches from the wooden mantel. I did not tear the paper. I did not crumple it in a sudden fit of rage. I held the cream-colored manifesto steadily over the iron grate. I struck a single match. The sharp, brief smell of sulfur cut through the stale air. I touched the small orange flame to the corner of the embossed envelope. The fire caught quickly. It gnawed at the thick paper, turning Bridget's elegant, demanding font into curling black ash. I watched the flames consume the ridiculous truffle potatoes. I watched them devour the Hansted quail. I watched the fire eagerly burn away the paragraph that dared to dictate that my wife was too old, too unsophisticated, and too ugly to sit at her own dining table. I held the paper completely still until the heat licked at my fingertips. Then I let the glowing remains fall gently onto the cold stone hearth. I stood in the profound quiet of my living room and watched the last red embers fade into gray dust. A massive, permanent transformation settled over my soul. The forgiving father who had overlooked his son's growing selfishness, who had made endless excuses for Curtis's reckless spending and emotional distance, died in those ashes. In his place stood the auditor, the man who deals exclusively in facts, consequences, and absolute ruin. Curtis and Bridget wanted our house to project a wealthy image. They wanted our resources to fund their lifestyle. They wanted the benefits of our lifelong labor, while completely erasing our existence. They believed they held all the power because they knew we loved them. They thought parental love was a weakness they could exploit endlessly. They were about to learn a very hard, devastating lesson about leverage. I made a silent, unbreakable vow to the dying embers in the fireplace. There would be no screaming. There would be no dramatic arguments or tearful pleadings for respect. Arguments suggest a negotiation, and there was absolutely nothing left to negotiate. There would only be the swift, silent, and permanent execution of consequences. The illusion of their control was over. and the demolition of their false reality was about to begin. The drive downtown was a blur of gray pavement and glaring brake lights. I did not turn on the radio. I did not roll down the windows. I sat in the absolute quiet of my car, letting the rhythm of the road match the cold, steady beat of my heart. For decades, I had navigated the treacherous waters of corporate audits, facing down men who had stolen millions, men who smiled to your face while shredding documents behind your back. I knew the exact posture of greed. I knew the precise scent of a lie. What I did not know, what I was entirely unprepared for, was finding that same posture and that same scent in the boy I had raised. I parked the car in the underground garage of the towering glass building where my son worked. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor was silent. When the silver doors parted, I stepped onto the plush carpet of his firm. The receptionist, a young woman with a practiced, polished smile, stood up and asked if I had an appointment. I did not stop. I did not look at her. I simply walked past her desk, ignoring her sudden calls for me to wait. I knew exactly where Curtis's office was. I had paid for the tailored suit he wore on his first day in this building. I had celebrated the promotion that put him in that corner office. I walked down the long corridor, my footsteps muffled, my purpose absolute. I pushed open the heavy glass door without knocking. Curtis was sitting behind an immaculate mahogany desk, staring at a dual monitor setup. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, a gold watch gleaming on his wrist. He looked up, his brow furrowing in instant irritation rather than surprise. He did not greet me. He did not ask how his mother was feeling. He simply sighed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair, asking what I was doing, interrupting his workday. I walked directly to his desk. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the charred, brittle remains of Bridget's 18-dish menu. I dropped it right in the center of his pristine workspace. The burnt edges crumbled upon impact, scattering fine black ash across his perfectly organized documents. I demanded a justification. I kept my voice entirely level, devoid of any shouting, completely stripped of the fatherly warmth he was accustomed to exploiting. I asked him to explain why his mother, a woman who had spent the last 10 months enduring agonizing physical therapy just to walk down a hallway, was commanded to stand over a stove for 3 days to cook a feast for his in-laws. I asked him to explain why the woman who gave him life was explicitly ordered to remain hidden in the kitchen like an unwanted stray dog, so she would not ruin the aesthetic of his holiday dinner. I waited for the shame. I waited for the realization to wash over his face. I waited for my son to apologize, to claim he had not seen the letter, to swear that he would fix this profound disrespect. Curtis did not flinch. He did not brush the ash off his desk. He looked at the burnt paper, then looked up at me, with eyes that were entirely hollow. There was no guilt in his gaze. There was only naked, unvarnished disdain. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on the desk, speaking to me as if I were a slow, difficult child. He told me I was being overly dramatic. He told me I was ruining a crucial moment in his life over a few hours of cooking. He explained with a chilling calmness that Bridget's parents were high net worth investors. He detailed how they held the keys to his next major promotion, how their social circle was the exact network he needed to infiltrate to secure his future at the firm. He claimed that this Thanksgiving dinner was not a family gathering, but a strategic business acquisition. He looked me dead in the eye and said that his mother's discomfort was a minimal sacrifice to secure his career. A minimal sacrifice. Those words hung in the sterile air-conditioned air of the office. He equated his mother's physical agony and emotional humiliation to a mere transaction, a small fee required to purchase the approval of his arrogant in-laws. He did not stop there. Curtis stood up, pacing behind his desk, fully surrendering to his own twisted logic. He complained about the burden of having aging parents. He complained that we were not wealthy enough to impress Bridget's family, that our suburban home was barely acceptable for hosting, and that Marlene's presence would only draw attention to our ordinary, unremarkable lives. He stated that we owed him this favor. He stated that after everything he had to deal with, the very least we could do was stay out of the way and make him look good. He demanded I go back home, apologize to Bridget for burning her instructions, and make sure Marlene followed the schedule to the letter. I stood motionless. I did not raise a hand. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the man pacing in front of me. I searched his face for the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest. I searched for the teenager who had cried when his childhood dog passed away. I searched for the young man who had promised to always take care of his mother. The boy was gone. The boy was entirely, irreversibly gone. In his place was a parasite wrapped in a tailored suit, a man who viewed his own family as nothing more than raw materials to be consumed and discarded for his personal advancement. He had not just allowed his wife to disrespect us. He had orchestrated it. He believed that his ambition granted him the right to strip us of our dignity. He believed that because I had always provided, I would simply absorb this abuse, as I had absorbed his financial recklessness for years. Curtis stopped pacing. He looked at me, expecting an argument. He was prepared to debate. He was ready to counter my outrage with more cold, calculated excuses. But an argument requires a belief that the other person is capable of reason. An argument is a plea for understanding. I had absolutely no desire to be understood by the stranger standing before me. I had seen the absolute bottom of his soul, and there was nothing left to salvage. I did not say a single word. I did not ask him to reconsider. I did not threaten him. I simply looked at the scattered black ash on his desk. Then I looked into his eyes one final time. I turned my back to him. I walked across the plush carpet, pushed open the heavy glass door, and left his office. I heard him call out my name, his voice tinged with sudden confusion, but I did not stop. I walked past the receptionist, stepped into the elevator, and descended to the parking garage. The silence that wrapped around me was absolute. It was the silence of a man who has finished gathering evidence and is finally ready to hand down the verdict. My son wanted to treat his family like a business transaction. He was about to find out exactly what happens when the funding is permanently cut. The drive back to the suburban periphery was a study in absolute mechanical focus. Walter did not turn on the radio. He did not roll down the windows to let in the cold autumn air. He kept his hands positioned perfectly on the leather steering wheel, his posture rigid, his breathing measured and slow. For 4 decades, he had navigated the labyrinthine, deceptive world of corporate audits. He had spent his entire professional life sitting across polished tables from men who smiled warmly while actively destroying the livelihoods of others. He knew the precise anatomy of greed. He knew the distinct, undeniable scent of a lie. What he had not anticipated, what he had never prepared himself to face, was discovering that exact anatomy and that exact scent residing entirely within the boy he had raised. The city skyline faded in the rearview mirror, replaced by the quiet, manicured lawns of his neighborhood. The contrast between the aggressive ambition of his son's office and the silent sanctuary of his own street was jarring. Walter pulled into his driveway. He shifted the car into park. He turned off the ignition. The silence of the vehicle wrapped around him, heavy and absolute. He did not feel anger. He did not feel sorrow. He felt only the cold, unyielding mechanics of a necessary execution. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was painfully quiet. He walked softly up the carpeted stairs and peered into the master bedroom. Marlene was asleep. She lay above the covers, her breathing shallow, her face tight even in rest. The mere anticipation of the holiday, the sheer terror of failing to meet the impossible demands placed upon her surgical knees, had exhausted her physical reserves. Walter watched her chest rise and fall. He looked at the medical brace resting on the bedside table. He made a silent promise to the quiet room. He closed the door gently and descended the stairs. He walked directly into the formal dining room. The room was vast, anchored by a massive custom-built mahogany dining table. It was an intimidating piece of craftsmanship. It seated 12 people comfortably. It featured intricate claw feet and a surface polished to such a high gloss that it reflected the crystal chandelier hanging above it like a dark, deep mirror. Walter remembered the day he and Marlene had purchased it 20 years ago. They had saved for months, envisioning decades of warm family gatherings, of grandchildren laughing around its edges, of holiday feasts filled with gratitude. Now the table had been completely stripped of its original meaning. It was no longer a symbol of familial warmth. It had been weaponized. Bridget had claimed this table as her personal territory. She had explicitly designed her Thanksgiving around this specific piece of furniture. She had visualized her wealthy parents sitting at the head of this majestic mahogany slab, admiring the crystal and the silver, while the woman who actually owned it remained banished to the kitchen, hidden from view like an embarrassing unpaid domestic servant. The table was the literal stage for his wife's planned humiliation. Therefore, the table could no longer exist within these walls. Walter pulled his phone from his coat pocket. He did not search for a charity donation center. He did not search for a standard moving company. He required immediate, irreversible action. He searched for a high-end estate liquidator, capable of rapid extraction. He dialed a local number. A man named Hollis answered on the third ring. Walter spoke with a flat transactional cadence. He described the 12-seat mahogany antique, He described the matching chairs, the pristine condition of the wood, and the flawless upholstery. Hollis hesitated, citing a fully booked schedule and a lack of available appraisal time. Walter bypassed the hesitation entirely. He offered the entire set for a fraction of its market value on one non-negotiable condition. The table and all its accompanying pieces had to be completely removed from the property within 2 hours. Hollis paused, quickly calculated the massive profit margin, and agreed without another word of protest. The arrangement was finalized. It was a cold, efficient transaction. Walter stood in the doorway of the dining room and waited. He did not pace. He did not second-guess his decision. He simply observed the furniture, seeing it not as wood and fabric, but as a fraudulent asset slated for immediate seizure. Exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes later, the low rumble of a heavy diesel engine broke the quiet of the suburban street. A large white box truck idled in the driveway. 3 men in gray uniforms stepped out, carrying thick quilted moving blankets, heavy canvas straps, and power drills. Walter opened the front door before they could ring the bell. He directed them straight to the dining room. He stood in the corner, his arms crossed over his chest, and watched the execution commence. The process was methodical and loud. The lead mover flipped the heavy dining chairs upside down, stacking them aggressively. The 2 other men crawled beneath the massive mahogany table. The sharp mechanical whine of power drills filled the room. The sound bounced off the walls, harsh and grating, completely obliterating the usual quiet of the house. Heavy steel bolts clattered against the hardwood floor. Thick metal brackets were tossed carelessly into a plastic bucket. The men communicated in short, sharp grunts, lifting the enormous tabletop off its ornate pedestals. Walter watched them wrap the dark polished wood in the thick gray blankets. He watched them pull the canvas straps tight, securing the bindings with loud metallic snaps. The physical labor required to move the piece was immense. The men strained, their boots sliding slightly against the floorboards as they maneuvered the massive slab of wood out of the room, through the hallway, and toward the open front door. Walter watched the chairs disappear 2 by 2. He watched the intricately carved pedestals follow. He watched the men carry the very foundation of Bridget's arrogant holiday plan out into the cold afternoon air. With every piece that crossed the threshold, Walter felt a corresponding weight lift from the structure of the house. The physical dismantling of the dining room precisely mirrored the systematic dismantling of his relationship with his son. Curtis had demanded a stage to project a false reality. Walter was physically ripping the floorboards out from under that stage. The movers returned for the final pieces. They swept the floor for stray bolts and handed Walter a digital tablet to finalize the transfer of ownership. Walter signed his name with a swift, fluid motion. The transaction was complete. The men walked out. They pulled the heavy metal door of the box truck down, the crash echoing down the street. The diesel engine roared back to life, and the truck slowly pulled away, turning the corner and vanishing from sight. Walter closed the front door. He turned the heavy brass deadbolt. The lock clicked into place, sealing the house. He walked slowly back down the hallway and stopped at the threshold of the dining room. The transformation was absolute. The space was no longer a dining room. It was a cavern. It was a vast, echoing rectangle of bare hardwood and empty walls. The floor bore faint circular indentations in the polish, where the heavy claw feet had rested for 20 years, temporary ghosts of a past that no longer mattered. The chandelier hung above, illuminating absolutely nothing. Walter took a step into the center of the room. His shoe struck the hardwood. The sound bounced against the drywall, sharp and distinct. He took another step, another echo. The room felt enormous, stripped of its function, stripped of its history, and entirely stripped of Bridget's toxic ambition. Walter breathed in the air. The scent of lemon polish and old wood was gone, replaced by the neutral, sterile smell of an empty space. He spoke a single word aloud, testing the acoustics of his newly barren territory. The sound reverberated back to him, hollow and clear. It was a beautiful, devastating emptiness. It was a perfectly cleansed slate. The first pillar of Curtis and Bridget's false reality had been eradicated. There was no table for her parents to sit at. There was no stage for her to command. There was only a void and the quiet, relentless momentum of an auditor moving down his list. The mahogany doors of Desmond Pruitt's law firm were heavy, designed to block out the frantic noise of the city below. Walter pushed through them with a steady, measured stride. The receptionist offered a polite greeting, but Walter merely nodded, walking directly down the corridor to the corner office. He had known Desmond for 20 years. They had sat across from each other in countless federal depositions, dissecting the financial ruin of corrupt executives. Desmond was a man who traded in absolute facts, and today, Walter was bringing him a ledger of deep personal betrayal. Desmond looked up from his polished glass desk as Walter entered. The lawyer immediately registered the shift in his old friend. There was no casual warmth today. Walter sat in the leather chair opposite the desk. He unclasped his briefcase and withdrew a thick stack of printed bank statements. He placed them on the glass surface. The papers slid forward with a soft, final sound. Walter instructed Desmond to look at the highlighted transactions. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and leaned over the documents. The silence in the room stretched out, punctuated only by the crisp rustle of pages turning. Desmond traced the highlighted lines with his pen. He saw the systematic withdrawals from the Joint Emergency Fund. He saw the routing numbers pointing directly to a luxury automotive dealership. He looked up at Walter, his professional detachment slipping just enough to reveal genuine shock. Desmond asked if Curtis had asked for permission to borrow against Marlene's medical fund. Walter replied that his son had not asked, nor had he borrowed. He had simply taken it, believing his mother's pain was less important than his wife's need for a status symbol. Desmond leaned back in his chair. He asked Walter exactly how he wanted to handle the situation. Walter did not hesitate. He did not ask for a mediation strategy or a warning letter. He asked for complete and immediate financial severance. The first strike was the vehicle. 2 years ago, Walter had co-signed the lease for Curtis's luxury SUV. It was a favor done out of blind parental trust, assuming his son was financially responsible enough to manage the monthly premiums. Walter informed Desmond that the vehicle was the absolute pride of his daughter-in-law, the very machine she paraded in front of her wealthy parents. Walter requested the immediate withdrawal of his guarantor status. Desmond warned him that doing so without notice would trigger an automatic default on the lease. The dealership would flag the account by the end of the business day. They would issue an immediate repossession order. Curtis would have no legal standing to keep the car. Walter nodded. He stated that a man who steals from his mother to lease a car deserves to walk to work. Desmond printed the withdrawal form. Walter took the heavy silver pen from the desk. He signed his name with a smooth, unforgiving stroke. The first chord was cut. The second strike required fortifying the remaining assets. The joint emergency account had been a fatal vulnerability. Walter instructed Desmond to immediately drain the compromised account and transfer every remaining cent into a newly established impenetrable offshore trust. This trust would be managed under strict, unyielding guidelines. It would be accessible solely by Walter and Marlene. It was a financial fortress designed to protect Marlene's future surgeries and premium physical therapy sessions. Desmond drafted the transfer authorization. He explained that once the funds were moved, Curtis would lose all access. He would log into his banking application and find an empty screen. His safety net, the very pool of money he had been treating as his personal slush fund, would simply vanish into thin air. Walter reviewed the terms of the trust. He read every line with the meticulous precision of a veteran auditor. He signed the second document. The ink dried quickly on the heavy paper. The second cord was cut. The final strike was the heaviest. It was the absolute dismantling of the future Curtis felt so entitled to claim. Walter asked Desmond to pull up his last will and testament. For decades, the document had been simple and traditional. Upon the passing of Walter and Marlene, the entirety of their estate, including the paid-off suburban house, the investment portfolios, and the retirement accounts, would seamlessly transfer to their only son. Curtis had built his entire arrogant worldview on this specific guarantee. He believed that no matter how recklessly he lived, no matter how cruelly he treated his parents, the wealth would eventually fall into his lap. He viewed his parents not as living people, but as a waiting room for his inheritance. Walter stared at the digital copy of the will displayed on Desmond's monitor. He saw Curtis's name printed there, stark and formal. A sudden wave of memories washed over him. He remembered teaching Curtis how to ride a bicycle in the driveway of the house he was now preparing to give away. He remembered paying for the expensive college tuition that launched Curtis into the corporate world. He remembered the pride he had felt on his son's graduation day. But those memories belonged to a ghost. The boy in those memories had died, replaced by a man who allowed his wife to order a crippled woman to stand in a hot kitchen for 3 days while he paraded his stolen wealth. Walter looked at Desmond. He ordered his lawyer to strike Curtis's name from the document completely. He demanded that Curtis be excised from the estate without a single provision or fallback clause. Desmond paused, his hands resting on his keyboard. He reminded Walter that disinheriting an only child was a permanent, devastating move. He asked if Walter wanted to leave a nominal sum to prevent the will from being contested in court. Walter refused. He stated that Curtis was to receive nothing, not a single dollar, not a single piece of furniture, not a single memory from the house. Walter then provided the new beneficiary. He directed the entirety of his estate to be liquidated upon their passing and transferred directly to a national foundation dedicated to protecting elderly citizens from familial financial abuse. The irony was deliberate and sharp. The wealth Curtis had waited his entire life to inherit would now be used to fight the exact type of parasite he had become. Desmond updated the document. The printer hummed to life, churning out the thick legal pages of the revised will. Desmond placed the papers on the glass desk. He arranged them neatly, squaring the edges. He handed the silver pen back to Walter. This was the point of no return. Once the ink touched the paper, the reality of their family tree would be fundamentally rewritten. Walter held the pen. He did not feel the crushing weight of grief he had expected. He did not feel a sudden urge to call his son and beg him to change his ways. He felt the cold, crisp air of a perfectly balanced ledger. Curtis had made a choice to value superficial status over the physical health and emotional dignity of his mother. Walter was simply processing the receipt for that transaction. He pressed the pen to the paper. His signature was firm, dark, and absolute. He signed the bottom of the first page. He flipped to the next and signed again. He reached the final page and placed his name on the dotted line. 3 strokes of a pen. In less than 10 minutes, Walter had systematically dismantled the entirety of his son's financial security. Desmond gathered the documents. He stamped them with his official notary seal. The sound of the stamp hitting the paper echoed in the quiet office, like the drop of a judge's gavel. Desmond looked at Walter, a quiet respect settling in his eyes. He informed his old friend that the paperwork would be filed with the courts by the end of the day. The auto lease cancellation would be transmitted to the dealership immediately. The bank transfer was already pending. Walter stood up from the leather chair. He buttoned his suit jacket. He did not look back at the desk. He thanked Desmond for his swift work. He picked up his empty briefcase. The bank statements and the old life were left behind on the glass desk. He walked out of the office, down the carpeted hallway, and stepped into the elevator. As the elevator descended toward the ground floor, Walter felt a profound lightness in his chest. The burden of hoping for a son who no longer existed was gone. He had spent years auditing corporations, finding the rotten cores hidden beneath shiny exteriors. Now he had audited his own family. He had cut out the rot. He stepped out of the building and into the cold city air. He walked toward his car, ready to go home, pack his bags, and take his wife to the ocean. The trap was set. The fuse was lit. All that remained was for Curtis and Bridget to strike the match. Wednesday morning broke with a biting frost that clung to the suburban windows like a sheet of pale ice. The house was entirely silent. It was completely devoid of the frantic, panicked energy that usually preceded a major holiday. In years past, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving was an absolute battlefield of preparation. Marlene would have been awake since 4 in the morning. Her hands dusted with white flour, the ovens radiating a suffocating heat, her face etched with the quiet desperation of a woman trying to meet the impossible standards of a son who never bothered to say thank you. For decades, she had sacrificed her own comfort to create the perfect illusion of a happy family gathering. Today, the kitchen was dark. The ovens were cold. The heavy silence was a definitive answer to a question Curtis and Bridget had never bothered to ask. Walter stood in the center of their master bedroom. He reached up and pulled two heavy leather suitcases from the top shelf of the closet. The leather was worn at the handles, a quiet testament to the decades he had spent traveling across the country, dismantling the fraudulent financial empires of corrupt men. He opened the suitcases on the bed. The zippers glided with a smooth metallic hiss. He moved with a cold mechanical precision, pulling resortier linen shirts and Marlene's favorite colorful sundresses from the wooden drawers. He packed methodically. He did not pack heavy wool sweaters. He did not pack formal dining attire. He was packing for a complete atmospheric extraction. He was packing for a life that no longer required them to bend to the whims of an arrogant child. Marlene stirred beneath the heavy duvet. She sat up slowly, her eyes adjusting to the dim gray light filtering through the curtains. She looked at the open suitcases resting on the mattress, and then looked out toward the empty hallway leading to the kitchen. A flash of conditioned panic immediately crossed her face. She looked at the digital clock on the nightstand, her mind automatically calculating the hours left to brine a heritage turkey she did not possess, to bake Arta sourdough she had no ingredients for. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, her hands reaching for her rigid knee braces out of sheer terrified habit. Walter stopped her. He walked around to her side of the bed. He gently but firmly moved the medical braces out of her reach. He knelt down to meet her eye level. He looked into her eyes and told her that her days of standing over a hot stove for people who openly despised her were permanently over. He told her to put on her most comfortable traveling clothes. Marlene looked at the steady, unyielding resolve etched into her husband's expression. She did not argue. She did not ask about the 18-dish menu that had haunted her all night. She simply nodded, placing her absolute trust in the man who had protected her for 4 decades. Walter left her to dress and walked down the hall into his study. The room was cold, holding the chill of the morning air. He opened his laptop, the bright screen cutting through the shadows like a blade. He opened a secure travel portal. He did not search for budget commercial airlines. He did not look for economical accommodations to save money for Curtis's future emergencies. He accessed the funds he had successfully fortified the day before, the substantial capital he had legally rescued from his son's grasping hands. He booked 2 first-class tickets to Kauai. He selected a secluded luxury oceanfront resort, far away from the noise and the concrete of the mainland. When prompted to select a return date, he bypassed the option entirely. He purchased one-way tickets. The absolute finality of the transaction was deeply satisfying. It was not a vacation they were embarking on. It was a geographical and emotional boundary. It was the physical manifestation of the impenetrable wall he had just erected between their peace and Curtis's greed. The confirmation email arrived with a quiet ping. The flight was scheduled to depart in exactly 3 hours. Walter closed the laptop. He opened the top drawer of his mahogany desk and withdrew a single sheet of heavy, unlined white stationery and a black ink fountain pen. He walked out of the study and stepped into the barren dining room. The empty space felt massive. It was a cavernous void where the imposing mahogany table used to dominate the room. The polished floorboards still bore the faint circular impressions of the heavy claw feet, acting as temporary ghosts of a domestic life that had been forcibly retired. Walter knelt on the bare hardwood floor. His knees popped in the quiet room, a sharp reminder of his own aging joints, but he ignored the stiffness. He placed the heavy stationery flat against the cold, polished wood. He uncapped the fountain pen. He did not write a long, emotional letter. He did not list Curtis's lifelong failures or detail Bridget's endless cruelties. He did not demand an apology or offer any sort of explanation for his actions. Explanations were meant for negotiations, and Walter was entirely finished negotiating with terrorists. He wrote a single, concise sentence. The ink flowed dark and absolute against the pristine white paper. He placed the note precisely in the center of the room, right where the head of the table used to be. He placed it exactly where Bridget had intended to sit and preside over his wife's humiliation. The white paper stood out like a beacon against the dark wood. It was a silent, devastating landmine, waiting patiently for a footstep. Walter stood up. He walked back to the foyer, just as Marlene descended the stairs. She was dressed in a soft woven sweater and loose, comfortable trousers, carrying her small leather handbag. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and looked at the empty space in the formal dining room. Her eyes widened slightly at the stark, shocking reality of the missing furniture. She looked at the single white note resting on the floorboards. She did not ask what it said. She did not ask where the table had gone. She looked at Walter. She reached out and gripped his hand tightly. Her fingers were warm, anchoring him to the only thing in this house that truly mattered. Walter picked up the two heavy leather suitcases. He opened the front door. The biting morning frost hit their faces, crisp and violently awakening. They walked out into the driveway, leaving the warmth of the house behind them. Walter loaded the luggage into the trunk of their sedan. He opened the passenger door for Marlene, waiting patiently until she was safely and comfortably seated before closing it with a solid thud. He walked around to the driver's side and slid behind the wheel. He pressed the ignition. The engine purred to life, a steady, reliable hum breaking the silence of the sleeping neighborhood. He pressed the button on the visor to close the garage door. He did not look back at the sprawling suburban house that had consumed so much of their lives. He shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the curb. They drove through the winding, affluent streets of their neighborhood as the city slowly began to wake up around them. The yellow streetlights flickered off one by one, surrendering to the pale, creeping dawn. Frost-covered lawns drifted past the windows, pristine and completely untouched. Delivery trucks began their morning routes, dropping off last-minute supplies for the massive, stressful holiday feasts being frantically prepared in every other house on the block. Inside the car, the heater blew warm, comforting air over them. Marlene rested her head against the leather seat, watching the bare winter trees speed past the glass. Walter kept his eyes fixed firmly on the road ahead. The highway stretched out before them, cutting through the waking city like a gray ribbon. He drove with the precise, unwavering focus of a man who had successfully navigated a treacherous extraction. For years, he had operated under the foolish illusion that giving more would eventually yield respect. He had believed that swallowing insults and writing checks would maintain family harmony. He realized now with crystalline clarity that compliance only bred contempt. Curtis and Bridget had fatally mistaken his silence for weakness. They had mistaken Marlene's quiet grace for eternal servitude. They approached the international airport. The massive glass and steel terminals loomed against the brightening sky. Walter navigated the complicated maze of departing flights, pulling up smoothly to the first-class drop-off zone. A uniformed porter approached immediately, taking their heavy leather bags from the trunk and placing them on a brass cart. Walter handed the man a generous cash tip. He offered his arm to Marlene. They walked through the sliding automatic doors into the bustling, overwhelming warmth of the airport terminal. The building was an absolute hive of holiday chaos. Stressed families dragged oversized suitcases. Crying children echoed over the constant drone of the public address system. Frustrated travelers argued with ticket agents. But Walter and Marlene moved through the frantic, panicked crowd in a serene, untouchable bubble. They bypassed the endless winding security lines, stepping through the priority screening gates with absolute ease. They found their way to the private luxury airline lounge. The space was quiet and insulated, heavily scented with fresh ground coffee and polished leather upholstery. Walter found a secluded, intimate table by the expansive floor two-ceiling windows overlooking the busy tarmac. He ordered them both a warm breakfast from the attendant. Marlene took a slow sip of her chamomile tea. She looked out at the massive commercial jets pulling up to the gates, preparing to carry thousands of anxious people toward their mandatory, stressful family obligations. She looked back at Walter. The tight, painful tension that had gripped the corners of her eyes for months was completely gone. She did not look like a woman terrified of a relentless cooking schedule. She looked like a woman who had just been handed back the keys to her own existence. Walter drank his black coffee. He watched a silver plane taxi down the long runway, its powerful engines roaring as it prepared for takeoff. He knew exactly what was happening back at the house. He knew that the silent countdown had already begun. He knew that in roughly 24 hours, Bridget would unlock that front door, expecting the rich aroma of roasted turkey and a perfectly staged dining room, ready to impress her parents. He knew Curtis would walk in, expecting to assert his dominance over his aging parents without a second thought. Walter took another slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. The trap was perfectly laid. The financial safety nets were burned to ash. The stage was physically dismantled and hauled away. All that was left to do was board a plane, fly over the Pacific Ocean, and wait for the spectacular explosion. The landing gear of the first-class cabin retracted with a soft mechanical thrum as the aircraft banked over the Pacific. Below the clouds, the ocean stretched out like an endless sheet of hammered silver. When the plane finally touched down on the tarmac, the golden hour light of Kauai washed over the runway. The sky was saturated with deep bruised purples and brilliant burning golds. Walter watched Marlene as she gazed out the window. For the first time in 3 agonizing years, the perpetual shadow of anxiety that had lived in her eyes finally began to dissipate. She breathed in the humid tropical air as they stepped off the plane, and a small, genuine smile graced her lips. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. They were met at the gate by a private driver who whisked them away in a climate-controlled vehicle. The drive to the coast was a blur of lush green palms and vibrant exotic flowers. The resort was a sanctuary of wood and stone, perched precariously above the crashing surf. They were checked into a penthouse suite that overlooked the vast expanse of the ocean. The air inside the room was thick with the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine. Walter walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass doors and slid them open. The sound of the waves rushed in, replacing the sterile hum of the city life they had left behind. Marlene moved to the balcony and took a deep, steady breath. She looked out at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip beneath the water. Walter joined her and took her hand. Her skin was warm, and for the first time in a decade, her pulse felt calm and rhythmic. There was no schedule to follow here. There was no turkey to brine, and no artisanal bread to bake. There was only the sound of the ocean and the crushing reality of their new life. Walter stepped back into the suite and retrieved his phone from his pocket. He stared at the screen for a long moment. He navigated to the settings menu and manually disabled the cellular network entirely. He did not want a single stray signal from the mainland to penetrate their sanctuary. He connected the device to the hotel's encrypted and secure Wi-Fi network. This was the only tether he maintained to the world he had just dismantled. He opened the security camera application that displayed a live feed of their suburban home. The screen flickered to life, revealing the interior of the house they had just vacated. The living room looked like a stage awaiting its actors. The dining room was particularly striking. The removal of the mahogany table had turned the space into a cavernous hollow shell. It looked like a tomb for a life that no longer existed. Walter zoomed in on the bare hardwood floor. He could see the small white note he had placed in the exact center of the room. It sat there like a lonely sentinel in the dark. He knew the schedule of his son's life better than he knew his own. He knew that in exactly 22 hours, Curtis and Bridget would pull their luxury SUV into the driveway. They would arrive with their bags of groceries and their expectations of a perfect holiday. They would step through the front door with the supreme confidence of people who believed they had successfully conditioned their parents into submission. They would walk into the dining room, expecting to see the stage set for their strategic business acquisition. Walter watched the screen. He could almost visualize the confusion that would cloud their faces when they realized the centerpiece of their grand design had vanished. He could see the note waiting to be read. He could see the entire edifice of their arrogance beginning to fracture. The house was primed for a spectacular collapse. Every element of the trap was armed and locked into position. Walter sat down on the edge of the plush bed, watching the feed from thousands of miles away. He finally understood the true meaning of peace. It was the ability to watch your enemies destroy themselves from a place of absolute safety and complete indifference. He stood up and walked back out onto the balcony, where Marlene was waiting. The stars were beginning to appear over the Pacific. He decided that tonight would be the first night of the rest of their lives. He pulled a chair up next to hers and watched the darkness fall over the water. They did not speak of the house. They did not speak of Curtis. They simply sat in the quiet dark of paradise, listening to the ocean wash away the wreckage of their past. The trap was set, and the countdown was running. Walter closed his eyes and let the sound of the waves carry him into a sleep, free from the weight of his son's failures. The Pacific sun beat down on the wide wooden balcony, casting a brilliant, uninterrupted sheet of gold across the teak floorboards. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. There was no frost here. There was no biting wind rattling the window panes or chilling the bones. The air was heavy with the sweet, intoxicating perfume of blooming jasmine and the sharp, clean tang of sea salt. Below our penthouse suite, the ocean rolled in rhythmic, mesmerizing waves, a brilliant turquoise expanse that seemed to swallow all the anxiety we had carried across the miles. Marlene sat in a cushioned rattan chair, her eyes closed, her face tilted upward to catch the warmth of the tropical sun. She looked younger than she had in a decade. The deep stress carved lines around her mouth, the permanent tension that usually gripped her jaw during the holidays, had completely vanished. Beside her, a private chef we had hired for the afternoon was quietly assembling a platter of roasted seafood. The rich scent of garlic, melted butter, and freshly caught mahi-mahi mingled seamlessly with the island breeze. It was a feast of absolute undeniable liberation. My tablet rested on the small glass table next to a sweating glass of iced tea. Its screen was dark, a silent black mirror reflecting the blue sky. I had disabled all cellular connections the moment we landed. No frantic phone calls could pierce this sanctuary. No demanding text messages from angry children could disrupt the steady, calming rhythm of the crashing surf. The only tether I maintained to the mainland was a highly encrypted, dedicated connection to the security cameras I had installed around the perimeter and inside the main rooms of our suburban house. I picked up the device and tapped the screen. The application loaded instantly, completely immune to the distance between us. The interface displayed a grid of high-defined feeds. The house was perfectly still. The living room was bathed in the dull gray light of a late autumn afternoon. Dust motes drifted lazily in the cold, unmoving air. The kitchen was impeccably clean, the massive ovens dark and cold, the marble counters completely devoid of the chaotic, stressful preparation that should have been in full swing. It was a silent mausoleum built to house their shattered expectations. Suddenly, a silent notification flashed across the top of the tablet screen. Motion detected at the front driveway. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, my breath slowing into a measured rhythm. I did not alert Marlene. She was savoring a piece of roasted fish, entirely engrossed in a light-hearted conversation with the chef about local spices and cooking techniques. I kept my eyes locked solely on the digital feed. A gleaming black luxury SUV pulled into the frame, its tires crunching loudly against the paved driveway. It was the exact vehicle I had leased for my son, the very car whose financial guarantee I had legally severed just days ago. The engine cut off. The heavy doors opened simultaneously. Curtis stepped out first. He wore a tailored wool overcoat, his hair perfectly styled, projecting the immaculate image of a successful, wealthy young executive entirely in control of his domain. Bridget emerged from the passenger side, draped in expensive cashmere, her posture radiating a manufactured arrogant grace. From the rear doors, her parents stepped onto the concrete driveway. They looked exactly as I had anticipated. They were wealthy, judgmental people, wrapped in designer coats, expecting to be catered to, expecting to step into a home that reflected their own perceived superiority and validated their daughter's social climbing. Bridget led the procession up the walkway. She gestured toward the landscaping, clearly taking credit for the manicured lawns and trimmed hedges I had paid for over the years. She pointed toward the architecture, spinning a narrative of ownership and dominance to her attentive parents. Curtis walked close beside her, carrying 2 expensive bottles of wine, playing the role of the generous, affluent host. They climbed the brick steps to the front porch. I switched the camera feed to the interior foyer, bringing the view closer. Bridget inserted her key into the lock. She turned it, pushed the heavy wooden door open, and stepped inside with a sweeping theatrical gesture, verbally inviting her parents into her conquered territory. The camera captured the exact beautiful moment the illusion began to fracture. As they crossed the threshold, their bodies instinctively prepared for a specific sensory experience. They expected the overwhelming rich aroma of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and warm butter. They expected the comforting, welcoming heat of a house that had been cooking for 2 solid days. They expected the sound of a bustling kitchen, the clinking of fine china being arranged, the subservient invisible presence of an aging woman forced into total submission. Instead, they were greeted by the biting chill of a house where the thermostat had been purposefully turned down to 50 degrees. They were met with the stale, stagnant air of an abandoned building. The silence was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that immediately drained the performative, smug smiles from their faces. Bridget stopped dead in the center of the foyer. Her cashmere coat hung loosely around her shoulders. She looked toward the hallway leading to the kitchen, her brow furrowing in deep, genuine confusion. She called out Marlene's name. The audio feed picked up her voice clearly. It was not a warm greeting. It was a sharp, irritated command. She expected my wife to come scurrying out of the kitchen, wiping her tired hands on an apron, ready to take their heavy coats and silently pour their wine. The house offered no reply whatsoever. The echo of her voice simply bounced off the cold drywall and faded into nothingness. Curtis stepped forward immediately, dropping his authoritative posture. He looked around the shadows, suddenly resembling a lost, frightened child. He called out for me. He yelled my name into the empty space, demanding an explanation for the unacceptable, terrifying silence. Again, the house remained perfectly, stubbornly mute. Bridget's mother, a woman with a sharp, severely lifted face, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She turned and asked Bridget if this was some sort of bizarre joke. She complained loudly about the freezing temperature of the entryway. The embarrassment began to physically manifest on Bridget's face, turning her cheeks a blotchy red. Her carefully manufactured reality was cracking in front of the very audience she was so desperate to impress. She marched aggressively down the hallway, her designer heels clicking sharply and angrily against the hardwood floor. She was heading directly for the formal dining room, the grand, expansive stage she had specifically chosen for her holiday triumph. She intended to show her parents the magnificent 12-seat mahogany table, to prove that she had successfully subjugated her husband's family into providing a luxury venue worthy of her lineage. I tapped the screen, switching the visual feed to the dining room camera. I watched as Bridget turned the corner and stepped into the room. She froze. Her body went entirely rigid. She stopped so abruptly that Curtis bumped heavily into her from behind. Her parents flanked them, looking past their shoulders into the space. The camera captured the devastating clarity of their collective realization. The room was not a grand staged dining area. It was an empty, echoing cavern. The massive mahogany table was gone. The 12 matching chairs were gone. The intricately carved pedestals were completely gone. The room had been stripped entirely bare. The polished hardwood floor stretched out from wall to wall, interrupted only by the faint circular ghosts of where the heavy furniture used to sit. The crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, illuminating an absolute, undeniable void. Bridget's jaw went slack. The illusion of her wealth, her control, her dominance simply evaporated into the cold suburban air. She looked around wildly, panicking, as if expecting the massive antique table to suddenly materialize from behind the curtains. Her father let out a low, disgusted sigh, muttering audibly about a pathetic waste of time. Bridget's mother turned to her daughter, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated contempt, asking if this empty room was the sophisticated holiday gathering they had been promised. Bridget could not speak a single word. She had no script for this scenario. She had planned to treat my wife like a stray dog, and instead, she had been left standing in an empty room, exposed as a complete fraud to the very people whose approval she craved more than oxygen itself. Curtis stepped past his paralyzed wife. His eyes scanned the vast emptiness of the dining room. Then he looked down, resting precisely in the center of the bare floorboards, exactly where the head of the vanished table used to be, was the single crisp white note I had left behind. Curtis walked slowly toward it. His footsteps echoed loudly in the hollow space. He bent down and picked up the heavy stationery. I watched his face closely through the high-definition lens. I watched as his eyes scanned the single sentence I had written with my fountain pen. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly gray. The arrogant corporate shark, who had sat behind a mahogany desk and told me my wife's physical agony was a minor inconvenience, was instantly, permanently gone. His hands began to tremble. The white note shook violently between his fingers. He read the words again, and then a third time, as if his brain simply refused to process the absolute finality of the message. He looked up, staring directly into the lens of the security camera mounted in the corner of the room. He knew I was watching. He knew exactly what this meant. He realized in that singular, devastating second that the funding was permanently cut, the stage was dismantled, the inheritance was erased, and the parents he had treated like disposable assets were irrevocably gone. I did not need to hear what he said next. I did not need to watch the inevitable, humiliating argument that would erupt between him, his furious wife, and her utterly disgusted parents. I had seen exactly what I needed to see. The audit was complete. The fraudulent account was closed. I pressed the power button on the tablet, plunging the screen into total darkness. The chaotic, toxic world of my son was severed. I set the device face down on the glass table. I looked up. The sky over the Pacific had deepened into a spectacular canopy of vibrant orange and dark bruised purple. The ocean roared against the shoreline, powerful and completely indifferent to the petty ambitions of mainland corporate climbers. Marlene turned to me, offering a plate of perfectly roasted fish, her smile bright and unburdened. I took a piece, savoring the rich, complicated flavors, knowing that the greatest feast of my life was the absolute profound quiet of a clean ledger. The afternoon sun hung low over the Pacific, casting long golden shadows across the teak decking of our penthouse balcony. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and blooming jasmine, a heavy, intoxicating sweetness that felt entirely foreign after decades of enduring the bitter cold of November in the city. Marlene sat across from me. She was relaxed, the tight, anxious lines around her eyes completely smoothed away by the tropical warmth and the profound absence of expectation. I held a glass of chilled white wine, feeling the condensation gather against my palm. The rhythmic crashing of the waves against the shoreline below provided a steady, calming metronome to the afternoon. Then the silence of our sanctuary was pierced. The sharp digital trill of my cellular phone cut through the sound of the ocean. I had disabled the main network connections, leaving only the hotel Wi-Fi active for the security cameras. But I had deliberately left the voice-over internet protocol open for this precise moment. I looked down at the glass table. The screen of the device glowed brightly against the shaded surface. The caller identification flashed with Curtis's name. The digital letters seemed entirely impotent, stripped of the power they once held over our household. Marlene paused her wine glass halfway to her lips. A brief, instinctual shadow of her old anxiety flickered across her face. She looked at the phone, then looked at me. I offered her a slow, reassuring nod. I reached out and tapped the screen to accept the call. I did not raise the device to my ear. I placed it squarely in the center of the glass table and pressed the speaker button. I did not offer a greeting. I simply let the connection open, allowing the serene ambient sound of the Hawaiian breeze to filter into the microphone. The response from this other side was immediate and chaotic. There was no hesitation, no formal hello, no attempt to maintain the facade of a civilized family checking in on the holiday. A shrill, piercing sound erupted from the small speaker. It was Bridget. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant, faux sophisticated tone she had weaponized for the past 2 years had completely disintegrated. In its place was the raw, unrestrained shrieking of a narcissist whose carefully constructed reality had just shattered into pieces. She demanded to know where the table was. She repeated the question in a frantic, rising cadence, her words tumbling over one another in a chaotic rush. She screamed that the dining room was completely empty. She screamed that there was no centerpiece, no fine china, no silver polished and laid out for her guests. She demanded to know where the food was hiding. She narrated her frantic search through the cold, dark kitchen, her voice breaking as she described opening an empty refrigerator and finding dead, unlit ovens. Then her panic turned vicious. She demanded to know where the invisible mother-in-law was hiding. She used those exact words. She asked where the servant had gone, insisting that Marlene was supposed to be there, stationed out of sight, ready to serve the feast that would secure Curtis's promotion. Bridget screamed that her parents were standing in the hallway freezing, and that the entire aesthetic of her sophisticated Thanksgiving gathering was completely ruined. I listened to the tirade with the clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a deeply flawed ledger. Her hysteria was the auditory proof of her moral bankruptcy. She did not express concern that her elderly in-laws had vanished without a trace. She did not ask if there had been a medical emergency or a sudden crisis. Her sole obsessive concern was the destruction of her performance and the absence of the unpaid labor she felt entitled to command. Beneath her shrill demands, I could hear the background noise of the disaster unfolding in my former foyer. I heard Curtis's voice, low and trembling, desperately attempting to plate his wife. He was murmuring frantic apologies, trying to usher her away from the open hallway. But the true devastation lay in the other voices filtering through the connection. I heard the distinct, sharp tones of Bridget's parents. They were not speaking with the polite, forgiving murmurs of guests encountering a simple mix-up. They were speaking with pure, unadulterated disgust. I heard her father ask, in a voice dripping with wealthy entitlement, what kind of pathetic joke this was. I heard her mother complain about the freezing temperature of the house, stating clearly that she had not traveled all this way to stand in an empty, barren room. Their confusion was rapidly curdling into contempt. The social capital Curtis had planned to purchase with his mother's sweat was vaporizing in real time. Bridget shrieked again, demanding that I answer the phone. She demanded that I tell her exactly when the caterers were arriving to fix this disaster. I did not speak immediately. I lifted my glass of wine. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The liquid was cold, crisp, and perfectly balanced. I swallowed, letting the profound quiet of the balcony stretch over the open line. The silence forced them to listen. It forced the frantic, panicked group standing in my cold suburban hallway to hear the undeniable sound of the crashing Pacific surf and the gentle rustle of palm fronds through the speaker. When I finally spoke, I kept my voice stripped of all emotion. I did not project anger. I did not project vindication. I spoke with absolute glacial clarity. I wanted every syllable to land with the weight of a judge reading a final sentence. I addressed Bridget directly. I told her that she was currently standing in a house she did not own, looking for a table that had been permanently liquidated, expecting a meal from a woman she considered too ugly to sit in her presence. I let those facts settle over the line. I heard a sharp intake of breath from Curtis, but I did not stop. I informed her that there were no caterers arriving. I told her that the illusion she had tried to build on the back of my wife's physical pain was officially terminated. I spoke slowly, ensuring that her parents standing right behind her heard every single word of my assessment. Then I addressed her frantic questions about the food. I told her that if she walked into the kitchen and opened the large pantry door, she would find the shelves fully stocked. I detailed exactly what was there. I told her there were 10 pounds of raw potatoes waiting to be peeled and mashed. I told her there was flour, yeast, and water for the artisanal sourdough she had so specifically requested. I told her there were raw quail eggs and jars of caviar sitting on the counter. I explained that an organic heritage breed turkey was currently sitting in the deep freezer, frozen solid as a rock. I kept my tone perfectly even as I delivered the final directive. I told Bridget that she had provided an incredibly detailed, minute-by-minute schedule for an 18-dish culinary masterpiece. I told her that since she possessed the vision, she was entirely free to roll up the sleeves of her designer cashmere coat and cook every single one of those 18 dishes herself. I informed her that the kitchen was hers to command and that she had exactly 3 hours before her parents would expect dinner to be served. The silence that followed was absolute. The shrieking completely ceased. The murmuring from the wealthy in-laws abruptly died. The sheer terrifying reality of the situation had finally breached the thick walls of Bridget's narcissism. She realized that she was not speaking to a compliant, subservient father-in-law. She was speaking to a man who had engineered her total and public humiliation with ruthless precision. Curtis finally found his voice. He grabbed the phone from his wife. His tone was no longer the arrogant, commanding bark of the corporate climber who had dismissed me in his corner office. It was the trembling, desperate plea of a man who suddenly realized he was standing in free fall without a parachute. He called me Dad. He used the word like a lifeline, a desperate attempt to invoke a familial bond he had personally destroyed. He begged me to tell him this was a mistake. He asked where the money in the emergency account had gone. He asked why the leasing company had just called him to repossess his vehicle. He begged me to come back and fix the situation before his career was permanently ruined by the angry people standing in the hallway. I listened to his panic. I felt no pity. I felt no paternal urge to sue him. The man on the phone was a stranger who had tried to harvest my wife's dignity for a promotion. I answered him with the same flat transactional tone I had used with his wife. I told him that an auditor's job is to identify fraudulent assets and eliminate them from the ledger. I told him that he had chosen to treat his parents as disposable resources, and the resources had simply chosen to dispose of him. I informed him that the locks on the house would be changed by a security team the following morning. I advised him to gather whatever personal belongings he and his wife had left in the guest room and exit the property before the police were called to remove trespassers. Curtis tried to speak again. He tried to offer an apology, a chaotic jumble of excuses about pressure and stress and misunderstandings. He tried to claim that he loved us, that this was all a terrible miscommunication. I did not let him finish the sentence. I reached forward and tapped the red button on the digital screen. The connection severed instantly. The panicked voices, the desperate apologies, the ambient noise of a collapsing false reality, all of it was immediately cut off. The phone went dark. The only sound remaining on the balcony was the steady, rhythmic roar of the ocean and the soft rustle of the tropical wind. I picked up my glass of wine. I looked across the table at Marlene. She was staring at the phone, her hands resting calmly in her lap. A deep, profound peace had settled over her features. The heavy, invisible chain that had bound her to a lifetime of unappreciated servitude was completely broken. She reached across the glass table and took my hand. We did not need to discuss the phone call. We did not need to dissect the panic we had just heard. The ledger was balanced. The audit was complete. I squeezed her hand, raised my glass to the setting sun, and finally allowed myself to enjoy the warmth of the evening. The frantic noise spilling from the speaker of my phone shifted in tone. The high-pitched shrieking of my daughter-in-law was abruptly muffled. It was immediately replaced by the heavy, aggressive sound of a sudden physical scuffle. I watched the live security feed on my high-definition tablet. Curtis stepped forward and physically snatched the phone from Bridget's trembling hands. He brought the device to his face. His knuckles were white against the dark plastic casing. His jaw was clenched with the familiar, arrogant tension he always used to intimidate his corporate subordinates. He did not ask what was happening. He did not inquire if his mother was safe or if we had suffered a medical emergency. He immediately launched into a barrage of furious, entitled orders. He barked into the receiver. His voice echoed loudly in the barren dining room, bouncing off the cold drywall. He demanded that I turn the car around this instant. He demanded that I drive back to the suburban house, apologize to his wife, and immediately rectify this catastrophic humiliation. He spoke with the blind, foolish confidence of a man who firmly believed he still held the absolute reins of power. He told me that I was jeopardizing his career. He told me that his in-laws were standing right there, and that my ridiculous stunt was making him look like a complete fool. He ordered me to fix it. He actually used the word order. I let him finish his frantic tirade. I let the silence stretch over the encrypted connection. I allowed the tranquil rhythmic sound of the Hawaiian surf and the gentle rustle of palm fermanes to whisper through the speaker into that freezing, empty house. I wanted him to feel the absolute distance between us. I wanted him to understand that his commands were landing on completely deaf ears. When I finally spoke, my voice was entirely stripped of the fatherly warmth I had provided for 35 years. I spoke with the precise mechanical cadence of a veteran auditor, delivering a final damning report. I told Curtis to stop talking. The command was soft, but it carried a weight that instantly severed his momentum. On the screen, I watched his posture falter. The aggressive forward thrust of his shoulders collapsed. He stood perfectly still in the center of the hollow room, waiting for my compliance. He was entirely unprepared for my execution. I informed him that our relationship was no longer a familial negotiation. It was a permanent financial eviction. I told him to look out the front window at the gleaming black luxury vehicle sitting in the driveway. I described the expensive leather interior and the polished custom rims. I reminded him how proudly he had parked it there to impress the wealthy people currently standing behind him. I kept my voice glacial and steady. I notified him that exactly 24 hours ago, I had legally and permanently removed my name as the primary guarantor of that specific auto lease. I explained the immediate unyielding consequences of that legal action. I told him that the dealership had already flagged the account for severe default due to his lack of independent credit. I informed him that by Monday morning, a commercial tow truck would arrive at his pristine corporate office to publicly repossess the machine he could never actually afford on his own. I wanted Bridget's parents to hear every single syllable of his financial inadequacy. I watched the camera feed as the blood rapidly drained from Curtis's face. He opened his mouth to protest, to offer some frantic, rehearsed excuse, but I did not afford him a single second of grace. I moved directly to the most critical line item on my ledger. I told him that I had spent the last 40 years of my life tracking corporate thieves. I told him I had spent decades staring down men who embezzled millions while wearing expensive tailored suits. I told him I never expected to find a common cowardly thief sitting at my own kitchen table. I recited the exact dollar amount. I spoke the numbers, slowly enunciating every single digit of the sum he had systematically siphoned from Marlene's medical emergency fund. I told him that he had actively stolen the money meant for his mother's surgical recovery simply to finance his pathetic illusion of suburban wealth. Through the speaker, the silence in that dining room became absolutely suffocating. The sheer moral bankruptcy of his actions hung in the cold, stagnant air. I watched Bridget's mother physically recoil. She took a distinct, deliberate step away from Curtis, her face contorted with pure, unfiltered disgust. The wealthy investors Curtis was so desperate to impress were currently listening to the undeniable proof that their son-in-law was a common predator who robbed his crippled mother. Curtis's voice cracked. He stammered, attempting to formulate a lie, attempting to claim it was a temporary loan, a brief transfer, a terrible misunderstanding. I completely ignored his pathetic defense. I delivered the final fatal strike to his constructed reality. I told him that the financial safety net he had relied upon his entire life was completely incinerated. I informed him that the joint accounts were permanently frozen, drained, and securely transferred to an impenetrable offshore trust. I told him that my last will and testament had been completely rewritten and legally certified by my attorney. I explained that the extensive estate he had been waiting to inherit, the wealth he felt so aggressively entitled to claim, had been entirely redirected. I told him the funds would go to a national foundation dedicated to protecting elderly victims from familial abuse. I told him he was excised. I told him he had been completely erased from our future ledgers. I stated that he had chosen to value a fabricated social status over the physical dignity of his own family. Therefore, he would now be forced to fund that empty status entirely on his own. I watched the high-definition tablet screen as the absolute finality of my words registered in his mind. The financial guillotine had dropped with a swift, clean strike. The illusion was completely severed. Curtis's hand began to shake uncontrollably. His fingers went entirely slack, losing all their aggressive grip. The cellular phone slipped from his hand. I watched the device fall in a slow, devastating arc. It plummeted toward the dusty hardwood floor. The sharp, violent impact echoed loudly through the connection, just before the line went completely dead. The call was over. I kept my eyes fixed on the silent video feed. The physical phone lay abandoned on the floorboards. Curtis did not reach down to retrieve it. He stood completely frozen, staring blankly at the empty space where the massive mahogany table used to reside. His arms hung uselessly at his sides. The expensive, tailored wool overcoat suddenly looked far too large for his shrinking frame. Behind him, the entire dynamic of the room had permanently shifted. Bridget stood with her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a potent mixture of horror and profound social embarrassment. Her parents did not move to comfort her. They did not offer a single word of familial support to the man standing in front of them. Bridget's father stared directly at Curtis. His expression was a flawless portrait of absolute unforgiving judgment. He was looking at a man completely stripped of his armor, a man exposed as a hollow, bankrupt fraud. The majestic holiday gathering was completely destroyed. There would be no triumphant dinner. There would be no strategic corporate alliance, forged over roasted turkey and expensive wine. There would only be the brutal, devastating reality of a man forced to explain to his furious wife and disgusted in-laws how he had managed to lose absolutely everything in a matter of minutes. I watched them stand in the freezing, empty cavern of the dining room. They looked like strangers trapped in a museum dedicated entirely to their own failures. I reached out and gently closed the security application. The bright screen went dark, reflecting only the blue Hawaiian sky. The extraction was officially complete. I leaned back in the comfortable rattan chair. I closed my eyes and listened to the steady, peaceful rhythm of the Pacific waves rolling against the sandy shore. Marlene rested her hand over mine. The air was warm. The ledger was clean. The future belonged entirely to us. 2 weeks drifted by under the warm, protective canopy of the Pacific sky. For Walter and Marlene, the passage of time was no longer measured by frantic, demanding deadlines or the heavy, crushing expectations of ungrateful children. Days melted smoothly into one another, blending into a seamless, comforting rhythm of quiet sunrise walks along the pristine beach and warm evenings spent watching the tide roll in. The physical transformation in Marlene was nothing short of miraculous. The rigid medical brace she had worn for painful months was discarded in the far corner of the closet, entirely unnecessary now that she was completely free from the brutal physical labor of maintaining a house she was despised in. She walked with a newfound lightness that brought a profound, deep ache of joy to Walter's chest. He watched her sip fresh local coffee on the balcony, her face glowing with genuine peace as the morning sun warmed her skin. They were healing in the quiet light, letting the salt air wash away the toxic, heavy residue of a lifetime spent trying to earn a love that was never truly theirs to claim. The days were theirs alone, dictated only by the rise and fall of the sun and the shifting ocean tides. In the digital ether, connecting the remote island to the bustling mainland, a graveyard of panic was slowly, aggressively accumulating. Walter kept his cellular phone secured in the heavy mahogany desk drawer, checking it only once a day to ensure the legal barriers he had erected remained firmly intact. The voicemail inbox was a descending chronicle of absolute unfiltered desperation. The first few days featured Curtis demanding immediate explanations, his voice thick with the arrogant assumption that his father would eventually cave to his anger and return to fix the mess. By the second week, the tone shifted dramatically into panicked, breathless pleading. The digital messages piled up one after another, heavy with the frantic, sickening realization that the financial safety net was truly burned to ash. Bridget left voicemails too, shedding her manufactured high society sophistication for raw, shrill hysteria. Walter listened to them with the dispassionate clinical ear of a stranger, evaluating a poorly performing asset. He did not feel the familiar painful pull of parental guilt. He felt nothing but the calm, solid certainty that he had finally done the right thing for his own survival. He deleted each message with a simple, quiet tap of his finger, refusing to let their chaotic noise infect his tranquil sanctuary. Back in the sprawling concrete maze of the city, the total collapse of Curtis's empire was unfolding with spectacular surgical precision. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning, right in the middle of the crowded corporate plaza. Curtis had parked his leased luxury vehicle in the prime spot strictly reserved for junior executives. He had walked into the towering glass structure, projecting the flawless, polished image of a man destined for the highest echelons of power. At exactly 10 in the morning, a heavy industrial tow truck rolled into the pristine corporate courtyard. The loud, grinding mechanical roar of the diesel engine shattered the professional quiet of the plaza. Curtis was in the middle of a critical strategy meeting, seated across from his senior partners in a transparent glass-walled conference room. He watched in slow, horrified motion as the tow truck driver casually backed up to the gleaming black vehicle. Heavy metal hooks were loudly attached to the pristine undercarriage. Bright yellow warning lights flashed violently, reflecting off the polished office windows for everyone to see. Panic seized Curtis by the throat, suffocating him. He completely abandoned the meeting, sprinting wildly out of the conference room and rushing down the stairs to the plaza. He burst through the revolving glass doors, demanding the driver stop the repossession immediately. He shouted desperately about simple misunderstandings and temporary banking errors, attempting to blindly save face. The driver, completely unimpressed by the expensive designer suit, handed Curtis a laminated legal notice. The document explicitly detailed the severe financial default and the total permanent withdrawal of the primary financial guarantor. The chaotic scene drew a substantial, eager crowd. Junior analysts and senior partners alike gathered near the expansive lobby windows, watching the golden boy of the firm publicly stripped of his manufactured wealth. The hydraulic lift engaged, raising the luxury vehicle high into the air with a loud mechanical whine. Curtis stood on the cold concrete, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public humiliation. The carefully constructed armor of his success had been ripped away in broad daylight, leaving him exposed as a complete fraud to the very people he had sacrificed his soul to impress. The public repossession was merely the opening act of his total, undeniable destruction. The true fatal blow came from the very network he had sold his parents out to secure. Bridget's parents had spent the 2 weeks since the Thanksgiving disaster conducting a quiet, ruthless investigation into their son-in-law's actual finances. The empty, freezing dining room had completely shattered their trust, and the subsequent financial revelations turned their initial confusion into cold, calculating rage. They discovered the full extent of his dangerous leverage, the staggering mounting debts, and the absolute complete lack of independent capital. They realized with profound disgust that they had married their only daughter to a hollow man whose entire existence was secretly subsidized by the elderly parents he so openly despised. They did not call Curtis to express their disappointment or offer guidance. Wealthy people do not waste breath or time on fundamentally bad investments. They simply acted. Bridget's father was a primary critical investor in Curtis's firm, holding substantial capital in several key portfolios. On Wednesday morning, the firm's managing directors received formal certified notices of immediate withdrawal. The capital was pulled entirely, without a single word of negotiation. The relationship was severed with brutal, unapologetic finality. The senior partners summoned Curtis to the top-floor executive suite shortly after the lunch hour. The atmosphere in the room was completely devoid of the usual fraternal warmth and corporate camaraderie. They informed him flatly that his personal financial instability and the sudden hostile withdrawal of his primary familial investors made him an unacceptable toxic liability to the firm. He was not offered a generous severance package. He was not offered a graceful transition period to save face or find other employment. He was handed a flat cardboard box and given exactly 20 minutes to clear out his desk under the close, unyielding supervision of corporate security guards. Curtis carried his solitary cardboard box toward the main elevators. The carpeted hallway felt 1,000 miles long, an endless gauntlet of shame. The same ambitious colleagues who had eagerly sought his advice just weeks prior now rapidly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply engrossed in their computer monitors. He was a pariah, infected with the fatal corporate disease of public exposure. He stepped into the elevator cage and watched the brushed steel doors slide shut, closing the final chapter on the career he had arrogantly believed was entirely his own brilliant creation. He had genuinely believed he was a self-made giant, conquering the financial world. He realized too late, as the elevator plummeted toward the ground floor, that he was merely a fragile paper kite, flying solely on the steady wind of his father's silent, endless generosity. Now the wind had completely stopped, and gravity was claiming its inevitable due. He took a crowded commuter train back to the affluent suburbs, arriving at the sprawling house that now felt exactly like a massive prison. He walked slowly up the long paved driveway, staring blankly at the empty space where his luxury vehicle used to sit just hours before. He unlocked the heavy front door, dreading the thick, suffocating silence inside. The house was instead in a state of frantic, chaotic movement. Bridget was moving rapidly between the master bedroom and the grand sweeping staircase. Two massive, expensive designer suitcases were sitting heavily by the front door, packed to the absolute brim. She was wearing her expensive tailored coat, holding her car keys with a tight, white-knuckled grip. Curtis dropped his cardboard box on the foyer floorboards, asking her what she was doing. Bridget did not look at him with any sympathy, or the foundational supportive love a spouse should offer in a moment of absolute ruin. She looked at him with the exact same cold, judgmental disgust her wealthy father had projected. She informed him, without a single tremor of emotion, that she was leaving him immediately. She told him that she absolutely refused to be shackled to a pathetic man who had lied about his worth and humiliated her family in front of their entire prestigious social circle. She declared firmly that she was returning to her parents' massive estate and that her elite lawyers would be contacting him by the end of the week to officially begin the divorce proceedings. She did not wait for his defense. She did not listen to his desperate, frantic apologies echoing through the hallway. She picked up her heavy bags and walked straight out the front door, closing it firmly and decisively behind her. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt locking echoed loudly through the empty foyer. Curtis stood completely alone in the center of the massive mortgaged house he could no longer possibly afford to keep. He walked slowly into the formal dining room. The space was still painfully bare, the polished hardwood floors echoing his slow, heavy, defeated footsteps. He looked at the exact spot where his father's final white note had rested 2 weeks ago. He was entirely, completely, and utterly alone. The grand, flawless facade was thoroughly annihilated, crushed into dust under the immense heavy weight of its own vanity. He fell to his knees in the center of the empty room, the crushing weight of his fully deserved reality finally pressing down upon his shoulders, burying the very last remaining fragile fragments of his arrogance in the dark, quiet shadows of his ruined life. 3 weeks after the flight to Kauai, Walter and Marlene finally returned to their suburban home. The heavy wooden front door swung open to reveal a house that had been entirely purged of its former toxic weight. The air inside was crisp and clean, carrying the sharp, distinct scent of fresh winter pine and the lingering cold of a building left to sit in absolute stillness. There was no trace of the manufactured holiday panic that used to infect these walls. Marlene walked into the empty foyer, dropping her travel bag on the polished floorboards with a quiet thud. She did not immediately rush to check the kitchen or inspect the surfaces for dust. She simply stood in the center of the room, breathing in the quiet tranquility of a space they had successfully reclaimed. Walter locked the door behind them, letting the solid metallic click echo through the hallway. He felt a profound sense of closure wrapping around him like a heavy protective coat. They spent the first few days settling back into a routine, dictated entirely by their own desires. They drank coffee in the morning light, watching the frost melt off the bare branches of the oak trees in the backyard. They read books by the fireplace, listening to the gentle crackle of burning wood instead of the shrill, demanding ring of a cellular phone. The massive empty space in the formal dining room remained exactly as they had left it. It was a beautiful, silent monument to their liberation. Walter had no intention of buying another mahogany table. He preferred the open room. It served as a daily reminder of the heavy burdens they no longer had to carry. The peace was absolute and uninterrupted until late Thursday afternoon. The sky outside had turned a bruised shade of violet as the winter sun began to dip below the neighborhood rooftops. Walter was in his study, reviewing his updated financial portfolios, when a heavy, desperate knocking echoed from the front porch. The sound was not the polite, measured rap of a delivery driver or a visiting neighbor. It was a frantic, hollow pounding. It was the sound of a man who had completely run out of options. Walter closed his laptop and walked slowly down the hallway. Marlene stepped out of the kitchen, her eyes meeting his with a silent, unspoken understanding. She did not look afraid. She simply nodded and stepped back, allowing him to handle the final piece of their necessary extraction. Walter approached the front door. He did not unlock the heavy brass deadbolt. He leaned forward and looked through the small glass pane. Curtis stood on the concrete porch. The physical transformation of his son was stark and undeniable. The polished, arrogant corporate executive who had confidently marched up these very steps on Thanksgiving Day was entirely gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out shadow of a man. His expensive, tailored wool suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with winter slush. His tie hung loosely around his neck like a broken leash. His hair was unkempt, and his face was drawn, pale, and lined with the heavy, exhausting weight of total financial ruin. He looked utterly broken, shivering slightly in the freezing wind. Walter opened the solid wooden door, but he kept the reinforced steel mesh screen firmly locked between them. The heavy metal grate served as a perfect physical manifestation of the boundary he had permanently erected. The freezing winter air rushed into the foyer, carrying the desperate scent of his son's panic. Curtis looked up. His eyes were wide and red-rimmed, swimming with unshed tears and the frantic energy of a cornered animal. He saw his father standing behind the steel mesh and immediately began to plead. Curtis spoke in a rushed, breathless torrent of words. He begged for forgiveness. He begged Walter to open the door and let him inside out of the cold. He claimed he had lost absolutely everything. He narrated his spectacular downfall in a frantic, shaking voice. He explained that Bridget had filed for divorce and taken up residence in her parents' estate. He explained that her father had personally ensured he was blacklisted from every major financial firm in the city. He told Walter that his bank accounts were overdrawn, his credit was destroyed, and the leasing company was threatening him with legal action over the towed vehicle. He stood on the freezing porch, crying openly, describing how he had been sleeping in a cheap motel until his last remaining credit card was finally declined. Walter stood perfectly still, behind the metal mesh. He listened to the pathetic litany of failures without a single trace of paternal sympathy. He watched the man who had happily planned to strip his mother of her dignity to secure a promotion, now beg for a warm place to sleep. Curtis realized his tears were not generating the desired effect. He quickly shifted his strategy, leaning closer to the mesh screen and attempting to shift the blame entirely onto others. He claimed he had been severely manipulated. He blamed Bridget for the extravagant lifestyle, stating that her endless demands for luxury had driven him into insurmountable debt. He blamed her wealthy parents for placing impossible social expectations on his shoulders. He claimed he was under incredible pressure at the firm, and that the toxic corporate culture had clouded his judgment and poisoned his priorities. He told his father that he had never meant to cause them any pain. He insisted that he was just a victim of circumstances, trying desperately to keep his head above water in a ruthless world. He begged Walter to remember the good times they shared when he was a boy, attempting to weaponize decades-old nostalgia to secure a financial rescue. Walter let the silence stretch out after Curtis finally ran out of breath. The cold wind howled around the porch, carrying the last dead leaves across the frozen lawn. Walter looked at his son through the steel barrier and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical certainty. He finally spoke. His voice was low, steady, and entirely devoid of any emotional warmth. He told Curtis that blame was the final refuge of a coward. He reminded his son of the specific afternoon 3 months ago when Marlene had returned from the hospital with a rigid brace on her knee. He reminded Curtis that instead of asking about her surgical recovery, he had immediately demanded a physical check to cover the deposit on a luxury vacation rental. He reminded his son of the sneer on his face when Marlene admitted the pain medication made her too tired to cook a formal dinner. Walter explained that no one had forced Curtis to exhibit such profound cruelty. He told him that Bridget did not write the script for his arrogance, and her parents did not engineer his lack of basic human empathy. He stated clearly that Curtis had made a conscious, deliberate choice to value a fabricated social status over the physical dignity of his own family. Walter informed his son that an apology motivated entirely by poverty was not an apology at all. It was simply a desperate negotiation tactic. He told Curtis that he felt absolutely no regret for dismantling the false reality they had lived in. He stated that the financial guillotine he had dropped was not an act of malice, but an act of basic, necessary justice. He told his son that he had spent his entire life providing a safety net, only to watch it be used as a hammock for greed. That net was now permanently gone. Curtis grabbed the steel mesh with his bare hands. He begged his father to stop talking and just let him inside. He cried out that he had nowhere else to go and that he was completely out of options. Walter did not flinch. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his heavy cardigan and retrieved a thick bound leather ledger. He had spent the last 2 weeks in Hawaii meticulously compiling this specific document. It was a flawless, exhaustive accounting of their entire financial history over the past 5 years. Walter stepped closer to the door. He slid the heavy leather ledger through the wide brass mail slot located near the bottom of the doorframe. The book fell onto the frozen concrete porch, landing right at Curtis's expensive ruined shoes. Curtis looked down at the object in total confusion, quietly demanding to know what the book was meant to represent. Walter spoke with the absolute authority of a man who had finally balanced an impossible equation. He explained that the ledger contained a precise itemized accounting of every single dollar Curtis had stolen from Marlene's medical emergency fund. He explained that it detailed every fraudulent credit card charge, every subsidized rent payment, and every luxury purchase secretly financed by his parents' retirement savings. The math was exact and undeniable. Walter delivered his final condition. He told Curtis that the door to his home would remain permanently locked until the balance in that ledger was fully restored. He told his son to take the book, to find a job, to rent a cheap apartment, and to begin the long, difficult process of earning a living with his own 2 hands. He instructed him to work until his hands bled and his pride was completely broken. He stated that once the stolen funds were entirely repaid, down to the very last cent, they could perhaps sit down and discuss the concept of earning respect. Curtis stared through the steel mesh, his mouth hanging open in silent, horrified disbelief. He finally realized that there was no hidden reserve of parental mercy left to exploit. The soft, comfortable cushion of his childhood was replaced by the harsh, unforgiving concrete of absolute accountability. Walter did not wait for a reply. He reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the inner wooden door. He looked his son in the eyes one last time, offering no final words of comfort or encouragement. He pulled the heavy door shut. The solid thud of the wood meeting the frame resonated with profound finality. The deadbolt slid into place with a sharp metallic snap, sealing the house away from the cold and locking the darkness out on the porch where it belonged. Curtis gripped the freezing metal of the security screen with both hands. His knuckles were bone white against the dark mesh. He pressed his face close to the wire barrier, trying to peer into the warm hallway. He was entirely stripped of the polished corporate veneer that had defined his existence for the past decade. He looked frantic and fundamentally hollow. His expensive tailored wool suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with the dirty slush of the city streets. His silk tie hung loosely around his neck, resembling a broken leash rather than a symbol of power. He shivered violently in the biting winter wind. He began to speak in a rapid, unbroken stream of desperate syllables. He invoked the concept of family, as if it were a magical incantation that could instantly erase the monumental damage he had caused. He used the word blood repeatedly, trying to tether himself to a biological connection he had spent years actively exploiting. He claimed that he was just a young man who had made a series of terrible cascading mistakes under immense pressure. He begged for a second chance. He pleaded for a quiet conversation inside the warm house. He promised that things would be completely different now that his demanding wife had abandoned him. He painted himself as a naive victim of her relentless ambition, completely ignoring his own willing, active participation in their shared cruelty. Walter stood perfectly still in the foyer. The cold winter air spilled through the open wooden door, biting at his face, but he did not feel the chill. He watched the tears stream down his son's pale face. He listened to the frantic, ragged breathing. He observed the entire performance with the detached clinical interest of a man analyzing a defective mechanism. For 35 years, the sight of his son crying would have instinctively moved him to immediate action. It would have triggered a deep biological imperative to soothe, to fix, to rescue, and to absorb the pain. That imperative was entirely gone. It had been surgically removed by years of quiet, consistent disrespect, and finalized by the theft of his wife's medical funds. Walter looked into Curtis's eyes and saw absolutely nothing but raw, unadulterated self-preservation. Curtis was not crying because he genuinely regretted the profound pain he had inflicted upon his parents. He was crying solely because he had lost the luxurious financial padding that insulated him from the brutal consequences of his own actions. Walter did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout over the howling winter wind. He spoke with a quiet, devastating authority that cut effortlessly through Curtis's frantic pleading. He told Curtis to close his mouth and listen very carefully, because these would be the absolute last words he would ever offer him on the subject. He stated that the words family and blood were not magical shields that protected a person from accountability. He explained that a true family is built on a solid foundation of mutual respect and basic human decency. He reminded Curtis that he had consciously, deliberately, chosen to view his aging parents as disposable resources meant to be drained for his own social advancement. Walter looked at the trembling hands gripping the metal mesh. He told Curtis that he was not a victim of manipulation. He was a willing architect of his own destruction. Walter delivered the final, unyielding truth. He told Curtis that a son who willingly trades his mother's physical health and comfort to finance a pathetic lie deserves to live entirely in the ruins of his own making. He reminded his son of the specific agonizing months Marlene had spent walking with a rigid brace because her surgery funds had been secretly diverted to pay for a luxury vacation rental. He stated that a man capable of such profound, calculated cruelty does not deserve the warmth of a family home. He told Curtis that the bound leather ledger, resting on the frozen concrete porch, contained the exact, precise accounting of every single stolen dollar. He stated that the ledger was now the only connection that existed between them. He demanded full, total repayment of the principal and every cent of the interest. He explained that until the debt was entirely cleared, the door would remain permanently sealed. Curtis opened his mouth to launch another desperate volley of excuses. The words never materialized. Walter reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handle of the inner wooden door. He did not hesitate. He did not offer a final, comforting glance or a lingering look of regret. He pulled the thick oak door shut with a smooth, practiced motion. The heavy wood met the doorframe with a solid, definitive thud that resonated with absolute finality through the quiet foyer. Walter turned the brass deadbolt. The sharp mechanical click echoed loudly in the silent space. It was the sound of a permanent boundary being locked into place. It was the physical manifestation of an impenetrable psychological wall that would never be breached again. Walter stood in the hallway for a long moment, letting the absolute quiet of the action wash over him. The frantic, desperate energy that had contaminated their front porch was entirely sealed away forever. He walked into the darkened living room and stood by the front window, looking out through the sheer linen curtains. The streetlights cast long, pale shadows across the frosted lawn. He watched Curtis stand on the porch for several long minutes, staring blankly at the closed door. The crushing realization of his total permanent exile was finally sinking into his bones. His shoulders slumped forward in absolute defeat. He turned slowly and walked down the brick steps. His expensive leather shoes slipped slightly on the icy driveway. He moved with the heavy, dragging gait of a man carrying the full, crushing weight of his own failures. He walked down the quiet suburban street, heading away from the only true safety net he had ever known. Walter watched him until his figure disappeared completely into the dark, freezing evening. He felt no urge to call him back. He felt no lingering ache of parental failure. He felt only the clean, sharp clarity of a necessary amputation. Walter turned away from the window and walked back down the hallway toward the kitchen. The atmosphere in the house had completely transformed. The lingering scent of cold air and panic was gone, replaced by the warm, comforting aroma of fresh pine and simmering tea. He stepped into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Marlene was standing by the marble counter. The rigid, painful medical brace was gone. She stood perfectly straight, her posture naturally graceful and entirely unburdened. She was moving with a fluid, effortless ease that he had not witnessed in nearly a decade. The agonizing physical tension that used to grip her spine during the holiday season was completely eradicated. The funds had been restored to her account, and her surgery was already scheduled for the following month. She was carefully arranging a bundle of vibrant, colorful wildflowers in a simple, tall glass vase. The bright yellow and purple petals stood out beautifully against the clean, modern lines of the kitchen. She looked up as Walter entered, her eyes bright and entirely clear of anxiety. Walter walked across the room. He wrapped his arms gently around her waist and pressed a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. Her skin was warm and smelled faintly of lavender and vanilla. She leaned into his embrace, resting her head against his shoulder. They stood there together in the quiet warmth of the kitchen, listening to the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the soft bubbling of the tea kettle on the stove. The massive, oppressive dining room table was gone. The frantic cooking schedules were gone. The toxic, demanding presence of a son who viewed them as unpaid servants was permanently gone. The house felt massive and airy, breathing with a new revitalized energy. Walter took the 2 small porcelain mugs of hot tea and carried them over to a small, intimate wooden table positioned right by the bay window. It was a modest round table, meant exclusively for 2 people. Marlene brought the glass vase of wild flowers and placed it right in the center. They sat down together, looking out at the quiet, frozen backyard, bathed in the silver light of the winter moon. The house was completely silent. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of endured humiliation or unspoken resentment. It was the rich, expansive silence of total, absolute freedom. They sipped their tea, letting the warmth spread through their chests. They did not need to speak about the man walking in the cold outside. They did not need to discuss the past. They simply sat together in the tranquil peace of a home that finally belonged entirely to them. True liberation often requires the painful but necessary severing of toxic bonds, even when those bonds are tied by blood. The story demonstrates that enduring silent abuse for the sake of familial harmony only breeds further exploitation and degrades one's own dignity. When a person consistently chooses greed and social climbing over basic human respect, they forfeit their right to compassion. By establishing absolute, unwavering boundaries and demanding strict accountability, an individual can reclaim their peace, their health, and their future. True family is defined by mutual care and respect, not by endless, unreciprocated sacrifice. If you found this story of reclaiming boundaries inspiring, please share it with someone who might need the courage to stand up for themselves today.